pleased that you've been able to take the time to listen to our story. So can you see the comfortable farming
yes,
images now?
All good,
the
thanks.
Cattle at the top and the sheep at the bottom?
Yep, all good.
Yep. All good? Good, all right. Well, we'll go on from there. The objective of the presentation is to provide an overview of how holistic grazing management has evolved on Moffat's farm in the Macedon Ranges. We call our grazing management holistic, comfortable farming, because it is comfortable for the livestock, for the biodiversity, and for ourselves, the owners. Now, there's a whole series of topics that you asked me to talk about, and I'm not going to run through them all, other than to say that we will cover why we practice holistic grazing. For us, it's all about understanding nature's connections between pasture species, grazing management, and ecosystem functions. I sometimes refer to what we are doing as comfortable farming connections, because as you'll see through the presentation, there's heaps of connections with ecosystems, with livestock health, with soils, with marketing. The connections are just enormous, and I tend to get a little bit sidetracked with those connections, and I hope I don't turn too much tonight. But so there are a lot of topics to cover, and I'm just going to touch on them. And sorry to some people who might not understand some of the terms I use, and if you don't understand, feel free to ask a question. We can either do it through the presentation or later on at the end of the presentation. But how we manage pastures and livestock grazing is really considerably different to what you'll see on most livestock farms in the Shire and probably across southeastern Australia. We maintain pasture ground cover year-round, irrespective of rainfall. That means that sometimes of the year we have a lot of pasture. We're not afraid of having large quantities of pastures, and don't think, like many conventional farmers and advisors, that we're wasting pasture because we have heaps of it. I will demonstrate the connections between holistic grazing management and improved ecosystem functions across the farm's conservation areas and pastures. This system has lower costs than conventional grazing while maintaining moderate productivity. Importantly, it embraces low-stress livestock handling and is extremely rewarding to work and live in. As well, to cap it off, we are in fact a net greenhouse gas sink and have been so since 2000. If I get a chance, I'll explain why we're a net sink, but it's a little bit complicated, but it's an important point to tell people about. So where have we come from and where are we at now? In 1986, we purchased Moffat's farm from my father, which was producing no recognisable ecosystem services, had no landscape merit, had low soil fertility and low soil pH, and grew mainly unproductive pastures typical of the district. The old bent grass, Yorkshire fog, sweet fernel, onion grass were typical on this farm. There were no native grasses that we could see, and livestock productivity was low. I'll talk about productivity levels on different pasture species as we go through. But we've transformed the property over the last 34 years. And the image just shows a stock take of what was like on the farm in 1986. Clear paddocks and degraded creek line. This is where we're at in 2020. There are two components to our comfortable farming transition since 1986. The first was restoring landscape balance with tree and shrub plantings across the entire farm. And the second component is restoring pastures for moderate productivity, for resilience to climate change, and to produce high quality beef and sheep meat that discerning consumers want to buy. And there's a little, the image shows the main points of what the pastures are like now. Some of the points worth noting is we don't do any fodder conservation, even though we produce huge amounts of pasture. We do occasionally have minerals supplementary feeding. but we have moderate soil fertilities. Our soil pH is pretty acceptable. It's above 5.5 in calcium chloride. Our carrying capacity is where we want it, at 12 to 14 DSE per hectare. Some people might want more, some might want less, but we're pretty happy with that. And we've planted around 10,000 native trees and shrubs, either with tube stock or with direct seeding through the riparian zone, through farm forests, and through just biolinks around virtually every paddock, which you'll see in a minute. So this is the transition with using the Google photos, just so you can see how we started. I say 1989 was actually the first image you would get. We started here in 1986, but you can see how things have changed right through to the present day. The changes, we've really moved from barren pastures to a complex ecosystem with productive pastures, abundant wildlife, and a pleasant landscape, as well as being a net CO2 sink. Well, I was not asked to talk about our wildlife restoration results. All I will say that with 23% of the land covered with biolinks, riparian planting and agroforestry, the wildlife return here has been spectacular. And it happens across the pasture paddocks as well. Too often people refer to biodiversity as only occurring in conservation areas. Well, we can show that it occurs across the entire farm, the pasture paddocks as well. Just the images here, just for you, so you can see what's happened. The top left-hand image is actually on my brother's farm, just 2 kilometres away, and it shows a riparian area with all the old manna gums and trees galore. And Moffat's farm, for some reason, it was just cleared completely, virtually. And this is the remnant here of one of the manna gums, and it's all, we've got about 5 of these remnant stumps. That's all we were left where we had when we came here. And why I think my idea is that the people, the early settlers and probably the Moffat's family themselves, they built so many things out of wood. For instance, the post and rail fences that we still can see on the place. And this is in the stables of Moffat's farm. And they're enormous pieces of timber that have been axed out of, I think, probably the manna gums that used to be here. They're amazingly wide. There's no knots in them. They're just clear wood timber. And the photo on the right is just how we're trying to return that sort of landscape amenity back to the area, to what it might have been. Well, it'll never be quite what it was, but at least it'll return to a more favourable environment. And the wildlife explosion, it just amazes us, and we keep seeing more things, like getting the koalas back here is incredible. The echidnas are an enormous number now, lots and lots of birds. And one of my favourite things that we like to see is all these frogs. I think we've got about 8 species, but my daughter Julie thinks we might have a few less than that, but there's a lot of them, and just every night. Like tonight, they're just out there in droves. It's really rewarding. We see birds of prey, which also tends to indicate that we've got plenty of wildlife on the ground as well. And this is the sort of thing that we're seeing on the ground, a lot of skinks, the blue tongues and the snakes. It's great to see them back, as well as the frogs. One of the things that people often don't recognise with holistic management, and we see it because of our pasture management, is this great connection between pastures and the soil, what they call the soil food web, or another food web. And things like the spiders use the grasses as scaffolds for their webs. And they can only do that because you allow the grasses to sometimes to go to head in late spring and keep them there through summer. And then the birds, this is amazing, the birds use some of the web to line their nests. These are fantails, I think. And that's fascinating. They also use the spiders, they eat the spiders. And lots of wasps. Got wasp nests, and wasps capture the spiders, and there's another little web of life going on. And here's another one that we really like, and that's the connection between our pastures and inhabitants and wildlife restoration. Here, hairy caterpillars. We see them, they're just coming on the pastures now. They appear about in early September, mid-September through October. And as soon as they appear, so do the fantail cuckoos come out at night. I don't know where they come from, but they come from. We've had about 3 species of cuckoo come. And of course the ibis come, and they feed on these little hairy caterpillars. Pasture cockchafers is another so-called pest that we don't consider them as a pest at all. We consider them probably a soil improver. And they also encourage birds, particularly ones like ibis. I have to put this photo in because it demonstrates one of the most exciting discoveries for biodiversity we've seen on Moffat's farm. This is a sugar glider, and strange. The only photograph I've ever been able to get of them was one that was climbing on the cottage wall one evening, but they're not normally there. What we've found is that the sugar gliders shouldn't, ecologists say they shouldn't be on Moffat's farm because we don't have any of the old trees for hollows for them to live and nest in. But they're here, and they're right through our forestry. They're through the blue gums, the sugar gums, and the, what's the other one? Also through our conservation corridors. It's amazing that they've turned up in the numbers that they have. My explanation is that they can live under the bark on a lot of these species, tree species, which are only 20 to 30 years old, and we don't have the hollows in those trees as yet. So that was an exciting development. But Jason didn't ask me to talk about wildlife, but I do make the point that often people underestimate the value of holistic management in returning biodiversity to farms and the agricultural zone. And we hear too much criticism of farming as being negative for biodiversity, and holistic management's been going very strongly probably for the last 30 years, and through land care and through land for wildlife programs. You've got a lot of farmers doing a lot of good for the environment and improving the biodiversity, but it goes unrecognised at both local government level, I think, and state government level. That's disappointing, but it's another story. What we now see is that on Cross Moffat Farm, one of the interesting developments has been the return of native perennial grasses. When we took over the farm, bought the farm in 1986, we didn't think perennial grasses even existed here, but they do. And the reason we know they do now is the grazing management program allows them to set seed. And you see wallaby grass, kangaroo grass, and microlina, probably some other species that I can't identify, but it's quite rewarding to see them. Not that they're major species, but they're just present again and getting the opportunity to flourish in our rotational grazing program. So let's get back onto the pastures that Jason wanted me to talk more about, and our comfortable farming system, which is a different way of thinking. We shifted from single issues, productivity and problem solving focus to a holistic, working with nature approach. Productivity followed at virtually no cost to our livestock operations. By growing more feed than the livestock need, we have year-round living haystacks in our paddocks. Our livestock enterprise has changed over the years. In the 1990s, we were breeding Angus cattle. In 2000, when we shifted to holistic management, we shifted to a cattle trading operation, buying yearling steers and heifers. And then in 2012, we shifted to a wilty pole shedding sheep, self-replacing flock. That is, you don't shear the wilty pole sheep, they just shed the wool that they have. The topic of what type of livestock enterprise to run is a webinar in itself, and our experience is, suffice to say here, that for us having complete control of livestock management and marketing with a small scale operation is what led us into the wilty pole self-replacing flock. Happy to answer any questions or give a bit more detail to that, but it's I won't say any more at this stage. Now, holistic grazing is about working with nature's variability, and what's most variable everywhere is rainfall, and it's getting more variable. I'll obviously spring is the key months in the district to set up feed for the rest of the year. But a failed spring happens all too often these days, as the stars on this slide show. This is our annual rainfall on Moffat's farm. These are our records, not BOM records. And the star shows the springs where rainfall was less than 122 millimetres over the 3 months. In 2000, we concluded that conventional livestock farming was inappropriate for Moffat's farm because it didn't allow for this climate variability, and the variability was, well, climate was becoming even more variable with climate change. So here's a bit more data on the rainfall at Moffat's farm, and it shows the seasonal decadal rainfall. And what this is really interesting because it highlights what's happened in spring, summer, autumn and winter. And the critical things you see with spring rain over the 3 decades is that they're not too bad, the spring rain. It hasn't really changed that much. And it's a reasonable amount in the 160 to 180 millimetres average over those decades. But when you then look at your summer, and it's quite interesting too. It's not too bad for summer rainfall in that we're in a pretty privileged area, getting 120 to 150 millimetres over the summer months. But look at autumn and what's happened in autumn. Autumn's a real killer in the district now, with rainfall really has been dropping for 2 decades, but I must admit in the last 1 decade, it has picked up a little bit. But the failure of autumn rain is a real issue for a lot of farmers in the district who manage their livestock under conventional grazing programs. And why it is shown in this sort of graph. When you look at averages are one thing, but if you actually look what happens year to year and when the rain falls is incredibly important. And it's just interesting, I took 2012 out, and when you look at the average rainfall for 2012, it was quite respectable, but it actually was a pretty miserable year in many respects, because the only reason it turned out close to average rainfall for the year was that in February there was close to 200 millimetres, and that was an exceptionally high rainfall. And if you had the right pasture species and the right grazing management, you were able to take advantage of that rain. But as you'll see later, if you didn't have the right pasture species, that big rain in February did little for you. And what 2012 ended up was a dismal spring and really quite a failed spring. Another year to note was 2010, where it was going along quite well with rainfall through the summer, autumn. Autumn was a little bit low, but then we got through winter, then we had spring. It was a colossal rainfall. It was an enormous amount of rain. So overall, the whole year wasn't particularly good, except the last few months made it exceptionally good. And 2019, which you all remember very well, I suppose, was a classic poor rainfall year, when January, February, March, April were the lowest, I think, 4 months on record for the district, certainly for us. But in May, what happened? We got good rain, and that really just changed the outlook of Moffat's farm exceptionally well. And the rest of the year, later on the year, late in spring, wasn't particularly good. But what set us up was the taking advantage of rain in May, June and July. So what I'm getting to is, if you've got the right pastures, you can get out of what I call a boom-bust pasture syndrome. And that boom-bust pasture syndrome requires fodder conservation and routine supplementary feeding. This is associated with conventional grazing management. In conventional grazing, the farmer counters poor seasons by fodder conservation, making hay and silage in spring and feeding it out during summer, autumn and winter. We stopped fodder conservation in 1999 when we changed holistic grazing management. And one of the reasons, well, we didn't need it once you change your attitude to pastures and work with nature to manage pastures. But there's another side to the story too, that small farms have no economy of scale. So every intervention like fodder conservation is far more expensive compared with larger farms. And this comes about by, and yes, we see it all the time, or we used to see it back in the 1990s. We'd say, well, we've got a 4-hectare paddock to cut for hay and silage, and the contractor would much prefer to go to a 10-hectare or 20-hectare paddock. It was far more cost effective. So we were tended to be put off until later in the season. And later in the season, as the season progresses, your fodder quality deteriorates, in particular if you go after producing hay. And in this district, hay is particularly difficult because of often summer rain in November, late spring rain or early summer rain, and you get these downpours and you can't cure it very well. And so the quality of hay in the district is pretty poor. So if you we move to silage because it's a quicker operation and less likely to be interrupted from by weather. But economies of scale make fodder conservation very expensive for small operators, and we're glad we're out of it. Another consideration which we used to have with fodder conservation was just having machineries to handle these rolls, and especially when you moved into silage. They're very heavy. They're around 500, 600 kilograms, and your ordinary small tractor just can't lift them. And we had to get a loan of tractor, etc., from a brother to utilise to handle these rolls. But apart from that, even feeding them out, you get a winter like this year and you start feeding rolls, and the pugging and the damage by the tractor on saturated soil was enormous. We can still see on Moffat's farm some of the ruts made by tractor back in the 1990s, where we used to store fodder rolls or silage rolls in conservation belts. And that damage is still here 20, 25 years later. So we're glad to be out of fodder conservation. If we do need fodder at any time, we will buy it in. So boom-bust pastures increase the risk of damage to ecosystem functions. And this is one of the most serious components of the talk of our experience, is that we're now moving away from any chance of damaging our ecosystems because there's not enough pasture covering the soil. It's the sort of damage that you're seeing in the photographs on the left, wind erosion, and on the right, water erosion after a thunderstorm. It's just all too common in southern Australia. And it's due to yearly paddock stocking rates exceeding yearly paddock carrying capacity. So I'll explain that a little bit more in a little while. As a result, when spring rainfall is well below expectations, as in 2019, 2018, 2015, 2014, 2012 and 2008, many livestock owners actually graze their properties into a drought condition with subsequent loss of paddock cover, exposing soil to wind and water erosion. As well, ecosystem services like biodiversity, soil carbon and soil water holding capacity are significantly reduced. Combined, boom-bust pasture impacts increase costs associated with supplementary feeding and pasture renovation, and they raise the stress level for everyone on the farm. Here's a classic reason why holistic grazing is so important and boom-bust pasture management is so destructive and costly. The paddock on the left, the two paddocks on the left-hand side of this image, I took from a Department of Ag webinar in autumn 2019. They were explaining, the webinar was all about explaining renovating pastures after the drought. This particular paddock was an example, was sown in 2017 and overgrows for months up until the autumn break in 2019, as you can see in the top left-hand corner. And the solution from in the webinar from the AgVic extension officer was to replant it. And I looked, this was a perennial pasture that they planted, and so they went about and the recommendation was to replant it. I looked at one of our pastures that was sown the same time in 2017, but we looked after it with holistic grazing management. And that's it in April 2019 versus this case study pasture in 2019. And we've got a heap of dry matter. It's still dry because it hadn't rained, but have a look what happened. It started to rain in about the 2nd of May. And by 13 days post that rain, we had 1,500 kilograms of green dry matter per hectare. Quite grazable. Whereas in the case study, the resowing was required in May, and the pasture wouldn't be grazable if it did grow during winter. It wouldn't probably be grazable till October. Yet we had the potential to graze this paddock again after about 3 weeks after rain. It highlights the importance of holistic management. Here's another, this is the ultimate example of why ground cover is so important. This is March 2009 on Moffat's farm. Well, the bottom photo is. The top photo is a district photo in the district. And it just shows we had a seriously poor spring in 2008. There was a little bit of a relief in December 2008 with quite a heavy rainfall. And then January 2009, there was only 2 millimetres, and February 2009 was another 2 millimetres. So we were really parched, and you might remember that was, I think it's what they call Black Saturday, was in March 2009. But the difference between looking after pasture and not looking after it is just extraordinary in terms of what it does to ecosystem functions. And I put in the little insert photograph on the left-hand side. That's in a paddock neighbouring where the cattle are. They hadn't moved into that pasture yet. The rotation's still going. And there's the pasture that's had a little bit of, had rest and was able to take advantage of the December rainfall. I'm going to show you this image later on because it's important for another reason about controlling what's grazing your paddocks. So the key to comfortable holistic farming is ground cover quantity year-round, quantity year-round, with a minimum, and this is my takeaway message for everyone tonight, minimum is 1,200 kilograms of dry matter per hectare with 80% perennial species. If you can remember that and work to it, I think, well, I think there's a big future for your grazing management and lowering your costs and for your ecosystem functions across your farm. The ruler, MLA have a rural pasture ruler, and it shows, it's a great little tool, and hopefully, Jason, if anyone wants to get them, you can just contact the MLA and they send them out to you. And the ruler gives you a guide to how much pasture bulk is in your paddock. I talk quantities of kilograms of dry matter per hectare, and the ruler is the simple way of working out what that is with a medium density pasture. And it shows you the height of the pasture, and it also then equates the height of the pasture to the quantity of pasture that's there. And the green zone on the ruler that you can see there reflects 4 to 10 centimetre pasture height and 1,000 to 2,000 kilograms of herbage dry matter per hectare. I'm showing 2 rulers there because on Moffat's farm, the single ruler usually isn't good enough to measure the height. Our pastures are so much higher than the single ruler measures, so we have a double ruler. And instead of thinking that 14 centimetres is high, we think 28 centimetres or 30 centimetres is high. We just prepared to grow a lot more feed than conventional grazing management recommends. In fact, a lot of people think in conventional grazing, or those who are involved in conventional grazing, that we waste pasture. but I don't think we waste it at all. The sheep can graze it, cattle can graze it, and if it's not grazed, it becomes organic matter for the soil. Now let's keep going, and it doesn't want to keep going. Why doesn't it want to go down? I don't know why it's not fine. Oh, here it is. Yeah. So sorry about that, just didn't want to go down. The next slide shows the pasture. Pasture ruler has a little problem. I'm not going to go into great depth now, but the problem is the red zones on the ruler. You can see in the photograph, there's a red zone here below 4 centimetres of pasture height, and there's a red zone above about 12 centimetre pasture height. We don't think above 12 centimetres should be a red zone. We certainly think below 4 centimetres should be a red zone. That is a danger zone for the health of the pasture, for the health of the ecosystem. But when you look at the back of the ruler, and this is what worries me about the ruler, is the ruler suggests that you can, with particular classes of stock, graze down to 400 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. That's down in this 2 centimetre, 1 centimetre, 2 centimetre zone. And I just don't think that's right. I think that's a mixed message, and it's a message that is misleading people in terms of what's safe for the viability of their pastures, the resilience of their pastures, and the resilience of the ecosystems across their pastures. So one of the issues with pasture bulk and avoiding boom busts is the percentage of perennial plants in your pasture. In our experience, 80% perennial plants and a maximum of 20% annuals, like subclover, is the right balance to maintain close to 100% ground cover and thereby protect ecosystem functions. Conventional grazing management encourages farmers to target up to 50% or more annual species like subclover. The photo on the right shows what happens to ground cover and ecosystem functions in summer and autumn when some subclover is above 20%. You end up with these bare paddocks that not only compromise ecosystem functions, but weaken or kill the few perennials that are left in the system. And they virtually require supplementary feeding every year and pasture renovation probably every 3 or 4 years. So I just don't understand how we can recommend such low pasture covers, especially during spring and summer. And part of the reason why you get such low pasture covers is that the annual plants, the subclovers, die in the end of spring and won't regrow until the autumn break, whenever that might be. On Moffat's farm, we have so many perennials. We often have more than 80% perennials. We have some subclover, but we're never short of cover during the harshest time of the year. And here's why pasture bulk from high percentage perennial grasses matters. This is these photos are in 2019. And in February, it's just the same paddock, so you can see the progression of what happens when it rains. February 2019 is around 3,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, and we were rotationally grazing through this. And we probably got it down more like by May to 1,500 kilograms. But here's in May, after it rained, it started raining in about the 2nd or 3rd of May, and by 25th of May, the pasture had regrown to around 1,500 kilograms of green dry matter. And go forward another few weeks, to 14th of June, we had around 3,000 kilograms of green dry matter on which to graze. We could have started grazing in May, but we didn't need to. We started grazing in June when there was 3,000. And remember, this is in winter, so we don't need any supplementary feeding because we can grow this sort of pasture mass. And so no point in cutting hay or silage when you can grow pastures like this. And the reasons why these plants grow so well when they get rain is the root systems and the soil and associated soil biology, which we'll talk about in a second. But I'm holding 2 pasture samples, and if you want, for reference, compare my hand in the left-hand photograph and the right-hand photograph. And the Moffat's farm pasture is about 3,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, and has a root stand at least 30 centimetres. The set stock pasture on the right, with around 200 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, has root stand only about 7 centimetres. Enormous difference. The implications of paddock ecosystem functions are great. The bulky perennials provide protection of the soil food web. The soil food web's all the living organisms on and below the surface. They prevent erosion of soil and nutrients, and they limit potential for weeds. In fact, we don't really have a weed problem in our paddocks at all. And then there's all the practical livestock nutrition and health implications of bulky versus sparse pastures. And there's much more associated with resilience in the face of climate change. It's not just about grazing management. The other big factor in comfortable farming in this district is growing pastures with the right species. And here's some examples, and we see these on Moffat's farm, but the photo on the left is bent and sweet vernal. The bent and sweet vernal is probably the most typical pasture across the Macedon Ranges and central Victoria, the high rainfall central Victorian districts. Then you've got a bit of wallaby grass in the middle, and you've got on the right-hand side a cocksfoot, tall fescue, multi-species, summer and winter active species pasture that we grow. And while I can't discuss it all tonight, is that the different pasture species have different structural components. The bent grass and sweet vernal, if it's allowed to flower, and when it goes to head, by about January and February, it just collapses on itself. The wallaby grass is a different structural component. It has tillers, and the heads stay up tall, and they don't fall down on top of each other. And similarly, the cocksfoot and tall phalaris, tall fescue and phalaris, its structure is quite different. And you can see a lot of green leaf, even though the plants have gone to head. And this is important for livestock grazing purposes, because those plants that fall down, like the bent grass and sweet vernal, the livestock don't want to graze them. They just don't like that tall, fallen over grass covering. Even though it looks like there's plenty there, there's actually very little valuable nutrition in those grasses. The wallaby grasses and the kangaroo grasses have better access to the actual leaf, but their palatability isn't as great as when you have things like the cocksfoots, the introduced pasture species like the cocksfoots and the tall fescues. And they tiller very well, and the animals, particularly sheep, can get to the green leaves without worrying about the seed heads. There's another issue too with the quality, and that's the amount of methane. Can't go into that, but the more leaf area you have for the animals to graze, the less methane our ruminants produce. So just to give people a guide to what different pasture species carry in this district, because I often get asked this, well, if I've got a bent grass pasture, what's the livestock carrying capacity of that sort of pasture? And in my experience, these bent grass, sweet vernal, silvergrass, onion grass dominant pastures, for low risk management, that is, you don't want to be supplementary feeding, you don't want to have to buy in hay, you might only get 2 or 3 DSE per hectare. If you start trying to run a higher carrying capacity than that, you start running into what I call a high risk at around 6 DSE per hectare. When you have a mix of improved and native grasses and some perennial species, improved species and poor perennial species, perhaps some native grass as well, relatively low fertility and low pH, and you have a rotation going, I think those sort of pastures have a carrying capacity around 8 DSE, and maybe a high risk around 14 DSE. And then the sort of pastures that we have on Moss's farm, which are mostly improved species, and they're summer and winter active varieties. We aim for optimum soil fertility and a pH and calcium chloride above 5.5, and we have minimum 6-week rotations. Well, for low risk management, around 10 DSE carrying capacity, and it's higher risk because of variable rainfall upwards of 18 DSE. So that gives you a guide to what the different pasture species can do. Now, I've talked about carrying capacity, and I'm not talking about stocking rate, and there's a good reason why I do that. Carrying capacity is what the paddock carries over the year. And we have monitored, all our 22 paddocks have been monitored since 1997 for their carrying capacity. And here's an example of one. It's trial paddock, we call it trial paddock. You can see that the carrying capacity varies from around about 10 DSE up to 25 DSE per hectare. That's over the years, the number of dry sheep equivalents that this paddock will carry over the year. And what we monitor so we can see, well, what's the impact of our grazing management? What's the impact of soil nutrition? What's the impact of pH on carrying capacity? And unless you actually monitor for carrying capacity, you're really guessing at what your management's doing. And you can see that with this figure, with rainfall, which is the star years, the carrying capacity isn't really influenced by rainfall at all under our holistic management system, grazing. We produce so much feed that we actually avoid the issues of boom-bust pastures. And so carrying capacity has stayed pretty even for this pasture right through our 20 years now that we've been holistic management. Prior to 2000, we were in more intensive grazing management, more fertilizers, etc., more conventional management. And the yellow piece in the histogram shows the contribution from fodder conservation to the carrying capacity in those years. We stopped fodder conservation and feeding out from 2001 on. But I've circled here the final carrying capacity, or last year's carrying capacity, which averaged out at 2015. Now, how you get that is you've got to look at your stocking rates. And this is why stocking rate is not carrying capacity, or carrying capacity is not stocking rate. Stocking rate is very different. It's the number of animals you put in on a pasture for a given length of time. And we work it out. Every time an animal goes into the paddock, we note it down, how many animals and what time, what their DSE rating is, whether they're, say, breeder cows, or whether they were weaner cows, cattle, or whether they're breeding sheep or lambs, weaner lambs. And you can work out your stocking rate. And over the year, this graph shows the stocking rate every time the animals went into the paddock. And this is the blue histogram, it's the DSE per hectare, and the red histogram is the number of days. The stocking rate varies considerably over the years. Here's 60 DSE, about 65, 70 DSE per hectare. Here, next one, it's just under 40 DSE, and goes through winter at relatively low stocking rates each time it's grazed. And then in spring, we can go up to 140 DSE. You put all the ewes and lambs in together, and that's how you get such high stocking rates. And because the grass is growing so well, you want to be able to utilise it with high grazing pressure. And so hopefully you can see that stocking rate is not carrying capacity. The important thing that you need to understand is that with an holistic management, your carrying capacity or your stocking rate never exceeds your carrying capacity through the year. The pasture species in the district, and the left-hand photo is pretty typical of what we see. A lot of sweet vernal, bent grass, onion grass, etc. And this is the Moffat's Farm pasture species on the right. And why pasture species is important is just highlighted again in a photograph which I've shown earlier. But here's same month in 2 different years, same paddock exactly. On the 14th of February 2019, everything's dry. It's a very dry year, as explained before. We have about 3,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. Same month, in 2020, we've had rain. The reason why these pastures are so green is that we plant summer active perennials as well as winter active. So you can buy summer active cocksfoot, winter active cocksfoot, summer active tall fescue, winter active tall fescue. And there's some others. There's legumes that are more orientated to summer or will survive summer, and subclovers are annuals. So we put a whole mix together because we've got the rainfall generally in most years to take advantage of summer activity. In areas north of the Divide, where rainfall over summer is lower, I wouldn't plant summer active species. And the big thing with summer active species, if you're going to plant them, is your management of them. You've got to have exceptionally good grazing management, because if you graze summer active species when they're green and it dries out and you keep grazing them, say with set stocking, you kill them. So summer actives really need good grazing management. Another part of the story is with summer actives is you can have a range of different species, and we include in some paddocks species like chicory and lucerne. They're both, you get summer active lucernes and you can get winter active lucernes, but we only would plant a summer active lucerne. We combine that with chicory, and you've got colossal feed through summer if you get any sort of summer rain at all. And as this little chart shows of the decadal rainfall, we do get reasonable summer active rain, summer rain in this district, and that sets us up for planting these sorts of species. Another summer active species which we like is the Brassica, and it's used for finishing lambs or finishing steers or heifers, and it's sown in October. We started with Winfred Brassica and moved to Mainstar Brassica after finding Winfred could be attacked by aphids. And it provides again, needs rotational grazing, and it provides grazing from January through to June, July. But its greatest value comes from grazing in January to April, where lamb growth rates, in our experience, are between 200 and 280 grams a day. By the way, I didn't mention for chicory, on the chicory lucerne, you get lamb growth rates over 300 grams a day, which is phenomenal. After we've sown the Brassica, we actually sow the paddock to the multi-species perennial grasses and clover mixes that I mentioned before. We do that by all direct drilling. We don't do any ploughing anymore. We used to do ploughing, but we've given it up completely. And now with this drill that I share with my brother, we're able to plant with direct drilling both the Brassica. Then after the Brassica, as on the right, we sow the perennial pasture. Direct drilling is far better from the environmental point of view, in my point, I believe, because you're not putting greenhouse gases out from tractors as you go round and round trying to make a seed bed. The only difference for the people who don't like using herbicides is that direct drilling requires herbicides, a knockdown herbicide, then we spray, then we plant. But weed control has to be very good to get your pastures up, either both with direct drilling or with ploughing. Another feature of our pastures is this, I better hurry on, is what we call fire refuge paddocks. If you can get these summer active species like chicory, lucerne, Brassica growing, we think they're very useful as a refuge during a fire, and also for strategic planting close to buildings to help for protection against fire. But just throw this slide in to say that when you're talking about pasture species, you have to do your homework. We're not dairy farms. The people who sow the most pastures and the most expensive pastures are dairy farmers. because they've got the production, they've got production targets to meet, and these cows need great nutrition. But in our part of with sheep and cattle, you've got to look at your grazing your capability for grazing management, the livestock carrying capacity, and how much money you want to spend. Because high quality pasture species are expensive and need a high level of grazing management if they are to persist and perform with these highly variable rainfall years. And if you can't provide it, think about other strategies to at least ensure ecosystem functions are protected across your paddocks. And that brings us quickly, got to better hurry up, to paddock sizes and rotations. This was Moffat's farm when we started, 1986, 4 paddocks only. In 2020, we've got 22 paddocks and 22 main paddocks and 6 what I call supplementary paddocks, small paddocks. A good tool to keep that you might want to get Jason to send you some more information on is this Google Maps area calculator for working out what size paddocks you can put on your farm. As for fencing, we started off with outriggers on conventional fences, and we shifted to, once we shifted out of cattle, when we still had outriggers, we were having a problem with kangaroos. So the photo on the right is my solution. The outrigger gets shifted up onto a 2.4 metre high post, and kangaroos can get through or over the fence without shorting the electric power, the power fence on the outrigger. We also had used power fence on top of conventional barbed wire fences in the cattle days to stop the animals leaning over into the conservation corridors that we'd planted. These days, with any subdivision fencing, we use prefabricated wire for sheep. It's a simple and relatively inexpensive fence to put up, and they've got better wire knots in these prefabricated fences these days, which helps prevent the kangaroos making big holes in them. Our power fencing days we still use power fencing. With cattle, it was just a single wire. It started off with a single tape, and then we moved to, well, why keep rolling up these tapes and moving them with temporary tread-ins? So we just made instead of a tape, we put a single wire in, and that worked really effectively. With sheep, we need 2 wires. The big challenge with electric fencing in subdivision like this is having good pastures, because if the animals are in a paddock with adequate feed, they don't want to push through the electric fence, or don't want to try it to get to the next paddock if they've got reasonable feed in the paddock they're in. And we don't have any problems with keeping our sheep in with 2-wire electric fence. In fact, a lot of the time it's off and they won't even go near it. But I know other people have had a little bit of trouble with electric fence, but we did train our sheep to electric fence in the first place. Another important fence is the exclusion fence that we have on the perimeter of the farm. We now have this right around the property because kangaroos were just too big a problem. With holistic management, holistic grazing management, what happens is you become an oasis for kangaroos when everyone else's pastures have been eaten out and you have green pastures, especially over summer and autumn, and the kangaroos just love you and they keep coming and coming, and then they degrade those good pastures that you have. So we had to go with holistic management. Once we started that in 2000, by 2002 we realised that we just can't keep all this kangaroo population as well as keep our pastures in good order and under control. So we went for the holistic exclusion fence, which was netting on the conventional fence. Then we added 4 more wires up to 1.8 metres high. This keeps out most kangaroos, but if some get in like this one, it's hard to get them out again. And if I was recommending, if someone said to me, I'm setting up a new farm, first thing I'd do would be consider an exclusion fence for the whole farm. It's fairly expensive, but ones like this one, this Clip-X fence, is just colossal. And the contractors who put it up, it's not on our farm, the contractors who put it up just so quickly and efficiently. and it solves all those problems with foxes and kangaroos, stray dogs, etc. You can rest easy with a fence like this. The only problem it does have to some extent is if you've got koalas, it might exclude the koalas. This is a good example of just what happens with kangaroos. They're just uncontrollable if you don't have exclusion fencing. And you try and sow a new pasture this is on my brother's farm. He's got a nice lot of corridors of conservation corridors and tree planting, which the kangaroos love to live in. And then they come out to the paddocks to graze, and they just can decimate a new pasture. And going back to this photograph, I said I'd mention again, and the point about the little inset photo of the green is the reason why we need green pastures, reason why with holistic management we needed an exclusion fence. That green in a dry summer is just so appealing to kangaroos that you're not going to stop them unless you've got an exclusion fence. And if they eat that green off and keep eating it, they're like set stock livestock. They'll just graze it into the ground and kill it. And that's the big deal with holistic grazing management, is control of grazing. Now, there's some areas just around the farm, the small paddocks, that we can graze with sheep, and it's one of the advantages of sheep over cattle. It's like in riparian zones, we can graze those briefly from time to time, and but I couldn't do it with sheep. And one of the reasons we want to graze them is to stop issues we have with ferals, particularly foxes, using those as pathways to the rest of the paddock. So, Jason, I think I was going to go on to fertilisers, but I think I'm running out of time. What do you think I should do?
I've got, I'll just give you a break for a minute, Patrick. We've got a couple of questions about, and we'll come back to that because there are questions about some of the fertilisers and so forth. So there was a question regarding what to do with such longer grass, what you would do about fire prevention. So I've just shared a couple of photos that I have of some ways, rather than slashing or getting rid of the longer grass, maybe the CFA, maybe the council will ask you about them, is to fence the paddock as you would and graze it rather than using the mechanical slasher. So you can use an internal electric fence, as this one shows here. And here's the boundary fence of this particular property. And you just graze around the outskirts of the property to create that fire break. Here's another example of one in a different situation, but the same issue is you can just fence it off so that you can graze it rather than mow it or slash it. You can use your cattle or sheep to graze around and prevent to create that fire break.
Yeah, well, we actually do the same thing, but we don't need to put in the special fences or the hot wire to do it, because with the number of paddocks you've got, you tend to graze the paddocks that are closest, say, to your infrastructure, to your cottage and yards, etc. You graze that down at the critical times, like before you get seed set, and to aim to prevent seed set so that you don't get the long grasses, summer grasses in those particular paddocks. So we have the same strategy using grazing management, but not with special fence. It's just the particular paddocks are grazed to prevent having too much herbage in the paddock over summer. the other point I make about it too is those fire refuge paddocks using things like chicory and lucerne and brassica as part of it's a small part but an important part of our program is to have some of those paddocks specifically for finishing lambs, or it could be for finishing steers, but also as fire refuge paddocks. And the other strategy that we have is that we will, if needs be, slash a paddock, but I generally don't do that because I don't like burning diesel to slash paddocks. So we use a livestock to do the work for us. So that's the solution that we have for fire, reducing fire threat.
Another question here is, I would love to hear about the transition to new perennial species. Were imports added, lime, phosphorus supplements? Did you need to stay off the cocksfoot for a couple of years to allow it to establish?
I was sort of getting
any way to avoid herbicide use?
Yes, there is establishment for us was moving out of bent grass and sweet fernal, and there's no way of getting other species back in my opinion, without either using the plough or using herbicide. We initially used the plough and it was very costly, and in this district with our heavier basalt clay soils, it takes a lot of passes and a lot of energy to get a seed bed. When we moved into direct drilling and using some herbicide, we got the same pasture result, or close to the same pasture result, with far less greenhouse gas emissions from machinery. But if people don't want to use herbicides, the first strategy is pasture manipulation using grazing management. Having smaller paddocks so you can manage what grows and how it grows. And we can get a lot of good result from managing smaller paddocks with good grazing, reasonable grazing densities, that is stocking rates, at critical times of the year. It's amazing. We're amazed that we got native grasses here, and the only reason we see them now is because of our grazing management. And I think that a lot of people have farms that have got a range of species, but they don't know what's there. If you start with your subdivision and then get your grazing management working and resting paddocks, as we talked about with rotations, it's amazing what will regrow. And the species that you don't want, you can graze strategically at different times of the year. For instance, just at the moment, the sweet fernal is starting to flower. If you want to stop sweet fernal flowering, you've got to have a high stocking rate on paddocks just at the moment, and you'll stop that flowering. It's in late November, early December. If you want to stop bent grass flowering, you graze at high stocking rates at that time of the year. And if you want to stop phalaris flowering, going to head or flowering, you graze heavily in October. So you can manipulate your pastures by your grazing management. So that's one way of doing it. And the other way of doing it, obviously, is your pasture renovation, either with direct drilling or ploughing.
Patrick, have you used fire
yeah, Jason, you probably picked up on one of my photos with direct drilling. What we struggle with when we do renovation in spring is that our paddocks grow so well, and I don't like to graze them, as I explained below, about 1,200 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. So you can't sow through 1,200 kilograms of dry matter per hectare with a direct drill. Well, that's our experience anyhow. So what I do is I graze it down to that 1,200 in spring, and then I spray it with a knockdown herbicide to kill everything that's there, to kill it, and then I will light it up and burn it off so that there's no herbage on the surface. It's a very cool fire. It doesn't even burn the material, the herbage that's laying on the ground. It just burns what's standing. And then I direct drill into that burnt ground, and it works a treat.
So the question was also, which you haven't quite answered yet, is what inputs do you put in when you spray it, when you sow it? Phosphorus, lime?
Oh, well, yes, that comes back to soil testing. We've been soil testing. Because I like information, I've been soil testing here every year since 2000. And so we've got a good grasp of what the nutrients in the soils are. And generally speaking, they're not too bad. The soil carbon's very good. We don't need, my view is, if your soils are limiting in particular nutrients, it is worthwhile replenishing those nutrients. Whether it's with manures or with chemical fertilizers, that's up to the individual's approach to chemicals or natural fertilizers. But if the nutrients are limiting, yes, I would put them in. But if they're not limiting, there's no reason to actually apply more fertilizer at sowing. It just depends what's limiting, and also the pH of the soil is also important. We don't have real problems with pH in soil here. We're generally above calcium, a pH of 5.5 in calcium chloride, which is the recommended level. But if your pH was below 5.5 in calcium chloride, well then you'd probably put lime on prior to the renovation. Or I'd recommend putting lime on, say 2 tonnes per hectare of a fine lime, if the pH was below the recommended levels. So to answer that question, don't just willy-nilly put fertilisers on. I only put fertilisers on if there's a strong indication that the level of particular nutrients is below what's required for your new pasture. And bear in mind, new pastures do require a reasonable level of nutrition to establish and to keep going if you want them to keep going for years, and we're expecting 15 to 20 years out of a new pasture. Well, you've got to look after them from a nutrition point of view. And just on nutrition, one of the best fertilisers we've found is, and I was going to talk about this, but with the photograph that I've got up, is livestock manure, either a poultry manure or a feedlot manure. It's a complete fertiliser in one thing. The biggest problem we have with livestock manures is that they're not readily available except in bulk. And if you're a small farm and you've got to get a bulk load of 30 tonnes, it's a fair amount for a small property. But if you can join in with some other, so I recommend join in with some other neighbours, and if you have to get 30 tonnes or thereabouts, you can spread it on your farm and have it spread on some neighbours' farms as well, to make it more cost effective.
And another question I have here is, what sort of water infrastructure did you have to change going from 4 paddocks, I assume the question, to now the 22 plus paddocks?
Yeah, good. An interesting question, an important one. When we came here, the only water was in the creek. And that was why the photographs that I showed early on just showed so much degradation of our creek. Since 1997, even the creek stops flowing. So that rainfall has dropped off quite so much in especially summer or more autumn, but it's more variable, and so our creek doesn't run as much. And we had to look at how do we get enough water for livestock. And what we found was that once we went to holistic management, and this is one of if there's a negative, the one negative with holistic management is your soils become such great sponges for moisture that you don't get runoff into dams anymore. In fact, we had, I think we put in about 6 dams around the property in the 1990s, none of them, once we went into holistic management, were getting water from runoff, because we don't get runoff. And the only way we got one dam to get runoff was to bring runoff from the road, Moffat's Lane, on the northwest side of our property, off that road, down our driveway and into that dam. And that's the only surefire way of getting runoff water into a dam. So what we did is, from that dam, we can pump water to the to a header tank on the highest point on the property, and then we reticulate water to troughs all around in all the 22 paddocks. But it's not necessarily all the 22 paddocks. If I showed you the diagram of the property, we try and do what they call cell centres and one trough will service up to 7 paddocks. So you don't have to repeat, have multiple troughs in this system if you organise it with your property planning to advantage. So yes, we've reticulated water. We have no water in dams, and we have no access. The stock have no access for drinking to the creek. We do graze the creek as at the moment. We can graze the creek. And it's not for water, it's to control all the excessive grass growth that we have along the creek, so that we don't have ferals in the creek. Did that answer the question?
Yeah. Thank you, Patrick. For those people that want to ask a question, please go into the chat feature and type a question in, and we'll get to them. From Ed, do you have a rabbit problem? And then
rabbits, not, I wouldn't say particularly. The last 2019 was our worst rabbit problem year, but interesting enough, we still see myxomatosis happening. And whilst last summer of 2019 there were rabbits, most of them are associated with our buildings. And also the riparian area. And one of the strategies talked about the exclusion fencing, I'm using netting, rabbit-proof fence, so that I don't want rabbits coming from neighbours. So we've got the netting and using a footing with the netting, so that if we see a rabbit tunnelling under the fence, we just close it down. But that's a big help, excluding rabbits from coming in from other places.
Do you use any biological applications such as foliar sprays, seed inoculants, etc., such as worm castings, seaweed-based products, etc., from Jamie? And then the following question is, we'll ask after that because it's a separate.
Right. We've trialled virtually all those products. I love doing trials on our perennial pastures, and I also include manures in my trials, as I spoke about before. The only product in our systems now, I've got to point out that the soils on Moffat's farm have between 4 and 5% carbon, which is between 8 and 10% organic matter. They are high, in Australian standards, they are high organic matter soils. So it doesn't surprise me that we don't get responses to biological inputs. The only response I ever get to visual response in the trials that I do is to nitrogen, because we have perennial grass dominant pastures, and they virtually always respond to nitrogen, because there's usually not enough. We don't have so much subclover that we're actually putting nitrogen back into soil through subclover. We have a little bit of subclover, but not enough to give sufficient nitrogen for the perennial grasses to grow as well as they could over winter. But it's not, we still get good growth rate over winter, and we don't normally need to put nitrogen out. But if we had wanted to put some nitrogen fertilizer, needed extra growth in winter, we could put nitrogen fertilizer on and get a response. We have never got a response to any biological products as yet, and I've got a response to manure, but that's because it's got nitrogen in it as well.
Next question is, where do you get your sheep processed and how do you get your product to your direct customers?
All our lambs are sold through Hardwick's abattoir. Well, they go to Hardwick's abattoir, and up until this year, 2019, we were selling the lambs to Meatsmith, a butcher shop in Melbourne, and they're a shop that wanted to tell the story behind the meat they sold to their consumers. Are interested in the story, the credentials of the property, the environment management of the property, the animal welfare of the animals that ended up as meat on their plates. And it was great selling to Meatsmith, and Meatsmith, the animals were actually processed at Hardwick's at Kyneton, which is only 30 kilometres away, and then they were delivered to Meatsmith down in Melbourne. That system has worked well up to this year, but with COVID-19 stopping Meatsmith selling the way they used to sell meat, we haven't sold this year to Meatsmith. We've just sold them direct to Hardwick's. We don't sell in the livestock yards because we don't believe that the animal welfare treatment through yard sales is good enough for the stock we produce.
Next question is from Nat. On the farm map you display, are the blue diagonal lines the electric fence runs for the sheep?
Yes, they've been for the sheep and the cattle. We've kept them the same for sheep and cattle. Yep. Just had to teach it just cut the cost of fencing, and it was easy to do. It's just all based on a solar powered energizer out in the paddock, just running off one battery. It's very effective.
From Jack, why did you choose, is it whipped pole ahead of other sheep breeds?
Wilty pole.
Wilty pole.
Wilty pole sheep. Wilty pole sheep are a shedding sheep. That is, they shed their wool each spring. There's only one other really, well, no, there might be some other breeds that do that, like there's the Dorper sheds its wool, but not completely. The Wilty pole is a characteristic that we like was their complete shedding, 100% shedding, and also I liked the meat quality that this breed produces. The breeder we originally got them from, I went to the butcher that he sold them to, and I saw carcasses from 22 to 28 kilograms that were just not over fat, and that really impressed me, that you could have some heavier weight carcasses without going to fat. And so we chose Wilty pole for that reason, but mainly because the shedding, because we don't shear, and you don't have problems with fly strike, no crutching, and we leave the tails on the lambs. We don't have to detail them because the tails shed as well. So it's another animal welfare advantage.
Have you considered Aussie white sheep?
Yeah, I think they're in the same, I have considered them, they're in the same boat as Wilty poles. I've considered them, but preferred to stay with Wilty poles for the time being, but doesn't mean we mightn't in the future use some Aussie whites.
If you've got any questions, please type them in. We've only got a few more minutes to go. While I wait for a couple more questions to come in, one I had was you showed your double ruler and talked about it being 30 centimetres high. How much of that 30 centimetres do you estimate that you're eating down when they're going through those paddocks? How much are you eating and how much are you leaving behind?
Well, that's affected by the time of the year, but at the moment, like into spring, when we lambing ewes went into 30 centimetre high pastures, and they'll eat those down to 6 to 8 centimetres high. And it's a funny thing, it's a good question, Jason, because one of the reasons we shifted to sheep was me being a little bit feisty about people coming here, and we used to have farm walks, and when we had cattle, and said, oh, you can never have holistic grazing management and those big bulky pastures if you run sheep. And I always wondered, well, why not? And so when moving to sheep, we didn't change our approach to the bulky pastures. We don't have any problem with the sheep eating them. If you've got the right grazing intensity, that's why I talk stocking rate. Remember, I showed a stocking rate graph, and in spring it was up to 140 DSE per hectare. That's a fairly high stocking rate for a pasture. And you can graze from 30 centimetre high pastures down to 6 centimetre high pastures without any trouble with that sort of stocking rate, and graze it quite evenly. The biggest challenge that we have with feeders later in spring, because we grow so much pasture and I'm not after maximum productivity, I'll drop some paddocks out of the rotation. So in end of November, December, if there's a paddock that I would think it would benefit from allowing the pasture to go to head and flower and set seed again, I will let that paddock go, and it mightn't be grazed again till March, April or May the next year. First you get 6 months off, and that is a massive feed. That is something like 5,000 to 6,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. And surprisingly, we don't have trouble with that. We can still put the sheep in and they'll still eat. They won't eat the tall stuff and the stalks, etc., but they'll eat a lot of the dry leaf, and if it rains, any of the new green leaf. And within a year, that 6,000, 5,000, 6,000 kilograms of dry matter, you'd never know it ever happened. You can restore the paddocks back to what you call more reasonable levels of pasture.
And you've spoken and written on your website about having that longer feed is valuable when you're lambing as well.
Oh, yeah, I didn't get to that in this presentation, but I've measured wind speed in our pastures, and you get those 30 centimetre high pastures as our lambing paddocks, and the wind speed at 10 centimetres, about 10 centimetres off the ground, is 0. And wind chill is an enormous killer of lambs in southern Australia, because a lot of lambs are born in winter. And in this part of the world, with our altitude, like in August, we lamb from about the 10th of August on. This year, we would have had 10 days in August with wind chills at some stage during the day below 0. And we haven't lost the lamb to the weather, put it that way, because they've got such good protection. I call it micro protection across the paddock.
Next question is, how often will you make adjustments to your HM plan during the year?
Adjustments to the holistic management plan, it really doesn't get adjusted to at all. Once you get into the system, once you start to understand pasture height, pasture masses, and this is why I like people having access to a ruler, and then having enough paddocks. And one of the points I was going to make at the end of the presentation was, if you've got 8 paddocks per stock class, and as a minimum. So we have 22 paddocks, and one of the reasons is that you have adult ewes, and then at weaning time in December, we'll have weaner lambs, and they've got to go into what I call their separate cells. The ewes keep going around their 8 paddocks, and the weaner lambs go around their 8 paddocks. And the same with cattle. You have, if you've got breeders, you'll have weaners. And to me, it's a good idea to have at least 8 paddocks for each group of livestock to rotate them around. And once you get into that mode of thinking, it doesn't change. It really never changes through the year.
Just a quick couple of answers to the next two, because we're quickly running out of time, is do you provide any free choice minerals for the sheep?
I have tried it, and interesting that that question was asked this year. I also bought a free choice mineral supplement this year for lambing, and I haven't had a ewe touch it. It's still sitting out there. No one, whether that says the ewes don't need it or they don't like it, I don't know, but it's not touched and it was expensive.
How do you train the sheep to the electric fence?
Good. Yeah, it's interesting. It's the best way to train them is to have good feed in both sides of the paddock, in a relatively small paddock, like half-hectare paddock, something like that. Good feed in both, so that there's not an urgency to get out of the paddock to get to the feed on the other side of the fence, and have a really good power fence operating, so that they touch it and they get the shock, and they'll obviously they either go back from it or they'll go straight through it to the other side. But we've found that once they've touched it, they never touch them again, and they stick right away from those fences. And like I said before, a lot of the time the fence is off and it's not a problem. So
do you have them at a relatively low stocking rate during that time, so there's not a lot of pressure on?
No, it doesn't matter. It's pretty well normal. Well, we would be looking most of the time at, say, 50 more DSE per hectare stocking rates, and it doesn't have to be low. It's just what I like to see is the animals just sort of moving up to the fence. They're not desperate to get through the fence, but they move up and just checking the grass pasture out along the fence, and then they put their nose on the fence and whack. They get a good whack, and everyone you see them, everyone gets a fright and moves back off away from the fence. And it's just a matter of doing that a few times, or the stock only need to do it once per animal, but once they get to know that that fence is live, they keep away from it. Well, that's our experience.
Time for sweetness, and as with these type of experiences, there's probably a long time that people could still chat to you, Patrick, but I've asked you all to unmute yourself, and so that you can join me in thanking Patrick. While you're doing that, I just want to remind people that next week we have another local farmers. There's two of them that'll be presenting next Tuesday. So if you haven't signed up for that, please sign up for that. If you're interested again in what we're doing with holistic management, there is a course offered only a week to go to sign up for that. So please look into doing that. And if you'd like to get some more practical tips on how to start implementing that, again, that is something that I, through the support of the National Land Care Program and the Macedon Ranges Shire, can help with. So get in contact with me. So I'd like you to all put your hands together in thanking Patrick for an informative talk this evening. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So informative. Thank you.
I hope people got something out of it. You're welcome.
Yeah,
Thanks, Patrick.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.